Let's move on. So we hit on the Horizon League tournament. We'll now shift our attention to the WCC, which again is in Rocco's area on the West Coast. So looking at the odds here, latest odds per DraftKings. This conference tournament tips off on Thursday. And again, we'll have full conference tournament preview breakdowns written over at thelines.com, so be sure to check those out. But St. Mary's Gonzaga open -110 each, so co-favorites to win the conference tournament. But Gonzaga took some early money, and they're now, again, not a huge differential, but -115, so 10 cents higher than St. Mary's, which the Gales are priced at -105. Santa Clara, BYU, both at 50-1. I want to hit on a thought there after Rocco goes. San Francisco, 100-1. LMU, which upset St. Mary's 2-3 weeks ago, 100-1 as well. Then Portland, Pepperdine, San Diego, and Pacific obviously round it out at much higher odds. So anything worth a dart there for you, Rocco? Because when I'm digging into St. Mary's a little bit of late, defensively they've been a little bit more vulnerable. And then you mentioned it when we were talking about college basketball futures. Gonzaga doesn't necessarily have that pro like we've seen in years past, like Jalen Suggs and Chet Holmgren, but also defensively, especially around the rim, they're very susceptible without that Holmgren-like presence with blocking shots.
Yeah, no, fair points. And I'm more concerned for Gonzaga's sake on the national level when they get to the NCAA tournament for that reason, depending on who they match up with. I think here in the West Coast Conference, probably the most surefire pro plays for Santa Clara in Pods. So with Pods, he's just so dynamic. He just won his 4th Player of the Week award, which is a new Santa Clara record. And a guy named Steve Nash played there, so that's a pretty big deal. And I think Santa Clara's got a nice setup to be they're the clear 3rd best team this year. The problem for them is they didn't get over the hump in any of their 4 tries against St. Mary's or Gonzaga. So Santa Clara's got to mentally get over that hump, and I beg to predict that they're going to be able to do that on back-to-back nights on a Monday and a Tuesday in the semis and the finals. But if there is a dart throw, it's them, because they do have a pro. They have a great offense. They had a huge lead on Gonzaga early. They let it slip. Last year, they beat St. Mary's at home in a big nationally televised game. So a lot of those guys are still there, minus Pods. So Santa Clara's got if anybody's going to do it, it's going to be them. The other side is LMU, who has actually beat both teams. I think LMU could easily lose to BYU in that 4-5 game before they get to Gonzaga. In fact, that's what I would predict. I think BYU's playing a little bit better basketball now, and BYU's playing better defense. And I love great defense when it comes to March. So that's a big deal. And so I think we do end up with that Gonzaga St. Mary's championship game. Ultimately, I think fans need to realize, if they don't already, this ladder bracket format pretty much makes it impossible for the 7 through 10 seeds to make any kind of run, and then BYU being 5, San Francisco being 6, in a really, really tough spot to make a run as well. So you really zero in on those last couple teams with this format. And in round 3, I will take Gonzaga, just because if you watch both the matchups, Gonzaga pretty much had both those games won, pretty convincingly the other night in the Kennel. And then in the first matchup, they had an 8-point lead with about 2 minutes to go on the road. End up, giving up a big rally there to St. Mary's and losing in overtime. But Gonzaga's looked a little stronger in the head-to-head. I also, even though I love St. Mary's, they're in my backyard, friend of the program for sure. They're a little bit vulnerable in these closer games. You saw them lose to Washington in overtime. They lost at home to Colorado State. New Mexico took it to them at home. They've been able to blow out a lot of teams, and that's really helped their numbers. But I think in close games, there's a lot to be figured out with this team. And so nod to Gonzaga from my standpoint.
Yeah, and we were DMing about this a little bit over the weekend, how Mark Few kind of threw a wrinkle at St. Mary's and Randy Bennett running out that 1-2-2 full court, 3-quarter court press, and not allowing St. Mary's to get into that patented ball screen offense, which Bennett adores over the last decade plus and beyond that. So, and St. Mary's offense, granted, they made a little bit of a second half push, but they weren't nearly as efficient as we saw down the stretch in the second half of that first matchup, where Aidan Mahaney took over with that ball screen offense, dominated, Gonzaga around the rim. And that's especially notable because of what I mentioned earlier. Gonzaga doesn't have that rim protection, which really allowed Mahaney to get to the basket. But a team that, you mentioned Santa Clara, and they're priced at 50-1. I'm curious what you think of the other team. And you kind of alluded to it a little bit, and especially when you were talking about matchups with the Horizon League, because BYU is priced at 50-1 to win the WCC tournament, and they wouldn't play Gonzaga, because I agree with you. I do think between the two teams, Gonzaga is playing better basketball of late between them and St. Mary's. So BYU wouldn't face Gonzaga until a potential title game matchup. They would get St. Mary's in the semifinals, and they've played two very close games against them already this season. BYU has the second-rated adjusted defensive efficiency in conference play, so that's also notable. And then you don't necessarily have a pro, but a really good collegiate player in Rudy Williams. So any shot you would consider BYU, the Cougs, to make it around, and a tournament-proving coach, too, in Mark Pope.
Yeah, I give them a little bit of chance. I mean, both those matchups were really good matchups. BYU just couldn't make the key plays down the stretch. They got Mahaney'd in the game in Moraga. It's a verb that's come to life here in the Bay Area. His clutch shot making when the Gales really need him, especially in those home games that they've been able to pull out, like the Gonzaga one. And so, they've been right there. And BYU is just a team that's built for the future. They got some awesome freshman talent, and Rudy's a vet that helps carry them. I just don't think I think it's possible to get past St. Mary's, so I'm with you on that. But I do think they're going to be in a situation where coming right after a big, emotional, tough, hard-fought St. Mary's game, St. Mary's is just going to do Gonzaga a favor. You're going to have a worn-down BYU team that Gonzaga will eat alive in the title game.
No, it's a good point for sure. If it were to get to that point, just from a betting sense, let's say you had that 50-1 ticket with BYU in the title game, you can't necessarily hedge off because Gonzaga is going to be, like you mentioned, a massive money line favorite pregame. But let's say somehow BYU starts out hot. Maybe Gonzaga's priced around -130, -150 live in game. And granted, you also can't necessarily get as much down in game as you can pregame for any sort of a bet, depending on the sports book, that is. Then you can maybe start to hedge off on your BYU futures ticket. Because I agree with you. From an emotional standpoint, from a tired leg standpoint, if you somehow beat that, well, I guess you're not going to be playing up and down against St. Mary's, but from a pace standpoint, if you somehow win that grind-out game against the Gales, very tough to turn around the next night because you don't have a day off in between that matchup and a potential BYU-Gonzaga title game. So good breakdown from Rocco there, as always, on the WCC, very close to home, very tight with the St. Mary's program, like he mentioned too. So hopefully Randy Bennett isn't pissed off as we're talking about some potential upsets here down the road.